Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're waiting just a few more minutes for Mr. Young to arrive, and we'll start as soon as he gets here. Thank you. Okay, we ready? Okay. My first meeting as a chair, so bear with me. The Subcommittee on National Parks, Forests, and Public Lands will now come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the impacts of climate change on public lands and to consider adaptation opportunities. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Today is an exciting day. It will be the first of a new era for this committee and for this Congress, an era of inclusion where the diverse voices of the American people are clearly heard in these halls. We will uphold our public lands as a point of pride that all Americans can share and co-own. These special places will serve as refuge for our highest values and as places of growth toward our nation's future. I want to start this hearing, the first of the 116th Congress for this subcommittee, by thanking my fellow members for joining me in this important work. I'm grateful for the confidence you have expressed in selecting me to chair this subcommittee. It is my sincere hope that we will find common ground on important issues, and I promise you that we will lead this Congress, the most diverse in history, toward bold policy solutions that benefit our federal lands and our communities. We begin that leadership today as we confront the most pressing issue facing our nation, which is climate change. We'll hear testimony from a leading scientist about the disproportionate impact climate change is already having on our public lands. Our national parks are warming twice as fast as the rest of the country. Parks in the Southwest, my home, and the home of many of my fellow members here on this dais, are experiencing unprecedented aridity. That means less water for our ecosystems, which in turn means less water for our homes and our farmers, because we live in a deeply interconnected world where changes to one system impact all others. We rely on the natural world to provide us with many of the things we depend on each day, from clean water and clean air to flood control and coastal protection. At a time when these natural services are under threat from global climate change, Americans will require strong leadership to ensure that we're ready to adapt to these changes and to meet these challenges. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has failed to provide this leadership. They see fit to pursue energy dominance at all costs, to push an extractive and destructive agenda that has left our public lands responsible for nearly 1/4 of all CO2 emissions. At the same time, the administration has suppressed science and prevented adaptation. They canceled executive orders outlining adaptation strategies on public lands and even pulled back guidance on climate change and national security. They ignored the science of climate change, relying on outdated and inadequate mandates, and put Americans in harm's way. If this administration will not take the lead, this committee will. Dr. Gonzalez will help us to understand the threat we face by explaining the impact climate change will have on our public lands. We will then hear from a top climate change adaptation scientist, Dr. Laura Hansen, because we can no longer afford to stand on the sidelines and do nothing. It is time for America to act on climate change, and our public lands are one of the best resources for us to do so. Public lands protect biodiversity and the ecosystems on which our daily lives depend. They provide space for the natural world to adapt to the new climate we have created. And they form the backbone of nearly a $1 trillion outdoor recreation economy that can help us create good, clean jobs. Climate change is an unprecedented challenge that will require big and bold solutions. Today, we take the first step toward meaningful action by hearing the risks we face and by considering how we can prepare our communities, our country, and our public lands for the challenges climate change presents. Thank you all for joining me here today. I look forward to our leadership on these issues. Thank you again to the witnesses. I look forward to your testimony. I now recognize Ranking Member Mr. Curtis for his opening statement.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to sit in for our Ranking Member, Don Young. And on his behalf and all of our behalf, I'd like to congratulate Representative Holland on her election to the House of Representatives and for being selected as a new chair of the National Parks, Forest, and Public Lands Subcommittee. I will now read Mr. Young's statement. I look forward to working with her in this Congress and the many important land management issues facing our country. Today, we meet to discuss the impacts of climate change on our federal lands and to examine adaptation opportunities. It is certainly my hope that we will use this time to discuss innovative land management solutions that fall under this subcommittee's jurisdiction. All too often, this issue has been used as a vehicle to push a radically progressive agenda that would prove to be devastating for American families and would offer minimal, at best, climate results. Among the policy goals that have been expressed includes calls for complete elimination of air travel, cows, and nuclear energy. Fear-mongering and unrealistic rhetoric should have no place in this debate. Instead, we should focus on pragmatic solutions that offer realistic environmental solutions. And on that note, I would like to turn the microphone over to Ranking Member Don Young to finish his statement.
Madam Chair, I apologize.
No need to apologize.
We're right there.
I will say that those that live on the hill that got it made, those that live 25 miles out, it's not good. I hate the traffic.
We're happy to see you.
Well, I'm here. First, let me congratulate you for being chairman. And I do apologize. This is a very important committee. I would say, seriously, we ought to start thinking about reducing carbon emissions, but we also ought to be talking about how do we address that in some of the areas which we have been working on. I think we have to look at the forest. This is something I'm very interested in because we have the largest national forest in America and Alaska, and we have lost use of that. 16.8 million acres of the forest. Only 4% has been managed for timber production, and consequently we have a very large forest that have dead trees. We've had that in other areas. I can tell you that in Alaska, because we did not manage, did not harvest some trees, I'm not saying all, we've lost 2 pulp mills, the large 5 large sawmills, and a lot of small mills, but we also lost 6,000 good, high-paying, middle-class jobs. For what cause, I don't know. They say, well, we got to protect it, but when we don't manage, we lose the forest. This has happened in the lower 48. People will talk to that, as we know. Tremendous forest fires is a loss, and it also contributes to the carbon, the gases in the air and the particulate amount in the air. And so I suggest respectfully one of our jobs is to see whether we can manage better instead of saying no, what we can do. Other countries have done beautifully. Sweden, if you go to Sweden, they've managed their forest for centuries. And they produce a lot of timber and they employ a lot of people. And it looks like a brand new forest. So that's something we have to consider, and I do think this is a great hearing. We have good witnesses today. There are differences of opinion. I just want us to adapt as part of this hearing, and I suggest I'm happy with what we're proceeding here, and I would submit the rest of my record and yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Curtis and Mr. Young. I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left and then red when time is expired. After the witnesses have testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. The chair now recognizes Dr. Patrick Gonzalez for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to speak on science of human-caused climate change in U.S. national parks. I am Patrick Gonzalez, a forest ecologist and Associate Adjunct Professor at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm also the Principal Climate Change Scientist of the U.S. National Park Service, but today I speak under my Berkeley affiliation, not for the Park Service. I've conducted and published field research on climate change for over 25 years. I've also served as a lead author on 4 reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The science organization awarded a share of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Wildfires burning in Yosemite National Park in California. Glaciers melting in Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska. Published scientific research has detected these changes and others in U.S. national parks and attributed them to human-caused climate change. The human cause of climate change is an important scientific fact because it points us to the solutions to the problem. Measurements show that cars, power plants, deforestation, and other human sources have increased carbon dioxide to its highest level in 800,000 years. This increase has intensified the greenhouse effect and increased temperatures to their highest levels in over 800 years. Human activities have caused 97% of historical heating. Colleagues and I published last year the first analysis of climate change trends across all 417 national parks. Our results revealed that climate change since 1895 has exposed the national parks to conditions hotter and drier than the country as a whole. Temperatures in the national parks increased at double the national rate. The temperature increase was 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Fahrenheit per century. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but 1 degree is the equivalent of pushing a mountain down 170 meters or 550 feet. That's the height of the Washington Monument, from cooler areas at higher elevations to warmer areas below. Also, rain and snow decreased more in the national parks than in the country as a whole. Hotter and drier conditions occurred because the parks are located, many parks are located in extreme environments in the Arctic, in high mountains, and the arid Southwest. As a result, in Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska, climate change has melted 640 meters of ice from Muir Glacier. That's 2,100 feet, more than the height of the One World Trade Center. In Yosemite National Park and across the West, climate change has doubled wildfire compared to the area of natural burning. In Rocky Mountain National Park and across the West, climate change has doubled tree death, particularly from bark beetles. In Noatak National Preserve in Alaska, climate change has shifted forest northward onto formerly treeless tundra. Climate change has raised sea level halfway to your knee in Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San Francisco, and all the way to your knee in New York City, not far from the Statue of Liberty. Climate change has killed coral reefs in Biscayne National Park, Florida. Continued climate change under the worst scenario could substantially heat the parks in the future, up to 9 degrees Celsius or 16 degrees Fahrenheit in Alaska. Our research shows that cutting carbon pollution could reduce projected heating in national parks by up to 2/3. The lowered heating would lower future risks. The U.S. has demonstrated its ability to cut emissions. The U.S. cut emissions 8% from 2007 to 2015. The U.S. Climate Alliance of 19 states and 1 territory has cut its emissions 14%, on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals. We achieved this progress with energy conservation, energy efficiency, solar, public transit, and other sustainable actions. In conclusion, the U.S. national parks protect some of the most irreplaceable natural areas and cultural sites in the world. Cutting carbon pollution would reduce human-caused climate change and help save our national parks for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. The chair now recognizes Dr. Laura Hansen.
Good morning, and thank you, Ms. Chairwoman, Ranking Member, and the committee for inviting me to speak about climate change in our public lands. I've had the honor to visit the Hill twice before to talk about climate change. First in 2004, when I was pregnant with my son, and I talked about the hopeful work I was conducting around the world to improve ecosystem management in the face of climate change, a discipline called adaptation. I urged the Senate to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and keep climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius. In 2007, I was invited back to testify on the effects of climate change on marine ecosystems. My son was now 3. I applauded Congress for the existence of several bills to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I repeated the need to keep climate change to less than 2 degrees Celsius, and I added a request for the creation of a national adaptation policy with an extension agency to provide technical support. The following year, 2 colleagues and I co-founded EcoAdapt in order to bring the skills we were supporting internationally to the United States so our own country could become more durable to the insults of climate change. A decade later, EcoAdapt is now a team of 12 supporting the innovation of adaptation approaches across the United States. We see a growing number of people incorporating the realities of climate change into their work, but not nearly to the extent necessary. We host the biennial National Adaptation Forum, and in 2017, we had over 1,000 attendees. We're a country of 325 million. Certainly, we need more than 1,000 people doing this work. Our country is utterly unprepared for the scale of this challenge. In every one of your districts, there are decisions being made every day, not only on public lands, but also on private lands and in our communities that are vulnerable to climate change. Not considering the implications of climate change will result in investments in infrastructure, management, and protection that will not garner the anticipated outcomes. Instead, we will end up spending additional funds to rebuild, risking community members' lives and livelihoods, and doing damage to our environment. Explicit consideration of climate change in our actions today is vital for our lives tomorrow. As lawmakers, you have the power to do something. From my 20 years of professional experience in the field of adaptation, I recommend the following. 1, create a national adaptation policy that requires the consideration of the impacts from and to climate change in evaluation of funding and permitting for land use activities, and quite frankly, everything else. 2, create a national climate change adaptation and mitigation extension agency. This would provide technical support to public and private land managers, and everyone else, at the federal, state, and local level. 3, require the protection and management of our public lands with an awareness that the climate is changing. This means the agencies entrusted to protect our public lands must evaluate the climate change vulnerability of ecosystems and the actions proposed on these lands such that they can act to reduce that risk. This needs to be part of how we do business. We must ensure that we're protecting adequate and appropriate space for ecosystems to function under changing conditions, including protecting refugia, connectivity, functionality, and employing forward restoration. We must support our land stewards with the staff and funding to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of management and give them the ability to make management decisions that prepare us for future conditions. We must manage lands for the long term to maximize our rate of return, which will be realized as access to clean air, clean and plentiful water, flood control, wildlife habitat, improved mental health, spiritual opportunities, recreational enjoyment, and long-term jobs. Our public lands must not be managed for quarterly profit margins. 4, reevaluate acceptable levels of non-climate stressors on our public lands. From roads or invasive species to overharvest or eutrophication to industrial chemicals from gas extraction and mining or chemical fire suppressants, the impact of these stressors can be compounded by the manifestations of climate change. And of course, since that child I spoke about at the beginning of my testimony is now a teenager, I know that I often have to repeat myself to get action, such as emptying the dish rack. So here it goes. Number 5. keep global climate change to well below 2 degrees Celsius. Actually, we now know that 1.5 degrees Celsius is the more prudent target. We need to reduce our national consumption and production of fossil fuels to stop making the problem worse. The cost of inaction is unaffordable for us and our children. I am delighted that Congress and this committee are again taking up the issue of climate change. This time, let's do something to increase the likelihood of good outcomes. Let's act now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hans Cole.
Chairman Holland, Ranking Member Young, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Hans Cole, and I'm the Director of Campaigns and Advocacy for Patagonia. At Patagonia, we're in business to save the home planet. On behalf of our 3,000 employees and their families and communities across America and around the world, I commend the committee for tackling this issue, and I strongly urge you to take bold action to address our planet's climate crisis before it's too late. The science reflects what we're seeing with our own eyes, and the voices of the American people and responsible businesses on the topic are clear. If we fail to change course, global temperatures will continue to rise, and environmental emergencies, wildfires, deadly heat waves, hurricanes, flooding, growing food shortages will grow worse. At Patagonia, we believe that clean renewable energy, regenerative organic farming, and public land and water protection should play critical roles in addressing the climate crisis. My testimony today will focus on our public lands. America's public lands are one of our greatest collective assets, but they are also the source of substantial greenhouse gas emissions. Almost a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. come from fossil fuels extracted from public lands or offshore waters. This will get much worse as the Trump administration continues its assault on land and water protections, despite outcries from outdoor enthusiasts and companies of all political stripes, who together represent a nearly $900 billion industry. We oppose the administration's proposed offshore leasing and drilling that would make more than 90% of U.S. waters available to oil and gas companies. We oppose an attack on Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge that would open one of our planet's last truly wild places for drilling. And we oppose the slashing in size of Utah's Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments and any reduction in size of other monuments as well. The administration's actions not only rob Native people and all Americans of their natural and cultural heritage, threaten communities that depend on the outdoor economy, poison our water and air, and damage vulnerable species, they also make the climate crisis worse. Opening up public lands to more extraction will increase emissions and destroy ecosystems that help mitigate climate change by storing carbon. Instead, Congress should impose a moratorium on oil and gas drilling in federal waters and bar drilling in Alaska's remaining wild places. We urge you to restore Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante National Monuments and support measures like Representative Holland, yours and Senator Udall's bill to make it clear that no president has the authority to undermine the protection of America's national monuments. Congress should also permanently reauthorize and fully fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which has used a small percentage of revenues from existing offshore drilling leases to protect 5 million acres of public parks, wildlife habitats, and recreation areas. Instead of further slicing up our landscapes and waterways, we should build wildlife overpasses and underpasses, invest in communities eager to remove unsafe and damaging dams, and strengthen large-scale wildlife corridors for migratory species. These are all bipartisan solutions that address climate issues and appeal to outdoor enthusiasts and businesses in every single state. Patagonia supports proposals to transition to 100% clean, renewable energy by 2050. We need to focus on the cleanest available technology, including wind, solar, and geothermal, and not rely on the false promise of outdated technologies like hydroelectric dams and nuclear power that have catastrophic consequences for our public lands and waters by producing toxic waste and driving species to extinction. If Congress takes bold action to address this crisis, it will challenge the private sector to step up as well, and Patagonia will continue to do our part. We are reinvesting $10 million from the 2017 irresponsible corporate tax cuts to groups working to solve the causes of the climate crisis. And Patagonia is committed to becoming carbon neutral across our entire business, including across our supply chain, by 2025. Please make 2019 the year that the U.S. finally takes decisive action to fight the climate crisis. Please reclaim our public lands and waters from the polluters and give them back to the people. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have for me.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. The chair now recognizes Dr. Elaine O'Neill.
Thank you. Chairman Holland and committee members, I am Dr. Elaine O'Neill, a forest scientist and management consultant specializing in forest health, climate change, and forest carbon accounting. Today, I will be providing comments on research I conducted at the University of Washington that examined the impacts of climate change on forest carbon in the 11 western states. That's contiguous states. We didn't look at Alaska. These results speak to the heart of the question before you today. What climate impacts are occurring on our public lands, and what adaptation opportunities exist? I'm going to place that research into context using examples from Washington State, my home state. First, some easy math. Trees take up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it to make wood, roots, needles, leaves, and branches, ending up at about 50% carbon by dry weight. Superficial analysis suggests that the more trees we have, the more carbon dioxide they can suck out of the atmosphere. That's only true if you ignore biological principles that dictate forest growth and death related to site carrying capacity. And in our western forest landscapes, and we have a lot of members here representing them, and it's also where most of our public lands are located, that's only true if we ignore fire, which would be a mistake. What we are seeing in the western U.S. is an epidemic of insects and disease and wildfires, brought on in large part by what one of your federal scientists calls an epidemic of too many trees. He talked about that epidemic of too many trees in a recent TED Talk called The Era of Megafires, and I've linked that for you. And I have to say, we are in an era of megafires. When we first began the analysis of climate impacts and forest carbon on these 11 western states, we used both historical fire rates for the region and fire rates that were predicted to occur by 2050. A look at the wildfire statistics since 2000 is sobering. We have doubled the average acres burned since 2000, with 10 of the worst fire years on record occurring since that time, and that doesn't even count last year. The statistics aren't in on that date. That means that the climate science published as late as 2004 was wildly optimistic. We are seeing future expected fire rates 30 years earlier than anticipated. So what do we do about these climate impacts? It's a bit counterintuitive, but we cut more trees. This wildly unpopular idea has been the recommendation of fire scientists who have studied the fire ecology of these systems for decades. This is not new information. It is completely in line with our fire and carbon analysis that examined 9 management alternatives across 25,000 forest inventory plots in the West. In other words, we didn't cherry pick the data. We looked at every plot and said, what would happen here? In most cases, managing forests creates a more favorable forest carbon outcome than letting nature take its course. Like any other potential natural disaster, whether driven by climate change or not, wildfire mitigation demands a response. Forest inventory data already show that 2/3 of the federal forest growth is lost to wildfire insects and disease, as shown on this chart on the wall. In some states, mortality already exceeds growth, meaning the forests are now carbon sources and not sinks. In other words, they're emitting more than they're absorbing. So while forests do store carbon, when they are left without care, the results are usually not what we want. Clearly, letting nature take its course did not provide much carbon benefit, especially since the climate impacts we are seeing are real, current, and often devastating. We know how to mitigate these climate impacts at both the stand and landscape level. It starts with greatly reducing the number of trees, keeping fire-resistant species, and interrupting fuel ladders so the fires don't spread as easily. Across the West, this treatment has been proven to keep forests alive when wildfires hit, and they will hit. That's inevitable. It's part of the fire ecology of the system. They can be easily replicated across the landscape using a systematic approach that considers adjacent landowners in order to create a patchwork of defensible space that is actually more akin to what our natural forests look like than they do now. Coordination across landowners is required. So is infrastructure that can handle the harvested material. Even with the best of intentions, we will not be successful unless efforts are made to ensure milling infrastructure remains viable. Shared stewardship approaches like we have in Washington and state, including the Good Neighbor Authority and local forest collaboratives, should continue to be supported and encouraged as a fundamental mechanism to move forward with keeping our public lands and adjacent forest lands healthy, fire resilient, and green. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. O'Neill. Thank you for the valuable testimony that you've given this morning. The chair will now recognize members for questions, and under Committee Rule 3D, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes. And I would like to recognize myself first for 5 minutes. And so my question to each of you, and if you could just each answer this one after the other, that would be great. Thank you all again for being here and for your testimony. As I mentioned in my statement, I'm excited for this subcommittee to take the lead on these issues. To fill that role, we need to recognize that now is the time to act on climate change. We can't wait any longer. While some response efforts may be beyond this committee's purview, the impacts of climate change affect the resources, lands, and communities we are here to protect, so it is our responsibility to consider all options. My first question for each of you is, can we prevent the worst impacts of climate change by land management strategies alone?
Land management strategies, adaptation, are important for improving ecosystem integrity. But our research shows that compared to the worst emission scenario, cutting carbon pollution could reduce projected heating in the national parks by up to 2/3. And clearly, that attacks the cause of climate change.
Thank you. Dr. Hansen?
I agree. I agree that one of the most important things we can do is adjust our land use. And in reality, almost everything in the United States is affected by land use. Our transportation habits are affected by land use. Our energy consumption habits related, both transportation and our homes, are affected by land use. However, at the end of the day, the core component that we have to take care of is addressing the root cause of climate change. We need to stop emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere from the combustion of fossil fuels.
Thank you.
I'd say from our perspective, we need to use all the techniques at our disposal. Land management is certainly one of them. We need to look at the types of land management. Protected public lands can help us make space for renewable energy and reduce our emphasis on fossil fuel extraction across the country, which can provide a massive impact on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. But we also need to think about other ways of addressing the climate crisis, including regenerative organic agriculture and looking at our entire energy mix across the board. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that land management alone cannot address or prevent the worst impacts, but if you look at the way within the wheelhouse of forests and forest management, part of the way that we look at that and we think about it is if you're able to maintain that sort of average forest carbon in your landscape and then use those products to substitute for other products that have a higher greenhouse gas footprint, like steel and concrete, then you do have an opportunity to have an additive effect based on how you use any kind of material that would be removed if you were removing those trees. So it's, there's some complicated processes in there, but there is a possibility to actually leverage land management and land use activities, where they're allowed, obviously not in parks, but where they're allowed to achieve additional benefits in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation.
Thank you, Dr. O'Neill. I'm glad we largely agree on that point. Now, Dr. Hansen, can you please explain why adaptation, particularly on public lands, can help us fight the impacts of climate change?
I would be happy to. Adaptation offers you the opportunity to try and maintain the function of whatever it is you're trying to do. In this case, it's the function of public lands, which are vitally important to all of our lives, whether we live in a city or we live in more rural parts of the country. Adaptation allows us to reflect directly on what are the implications that we anticipate happening from climate change, and how do we change management to respond to that. That will affect our ability to access water, for example. In the Sierra Nevada of California, the way that those forests are managed provides water for most of the largest places in the state. Water is obviously a big issue there. But if we continue to manage the water resource and the forest resource, as we always have, ignoring the facts that precipitation patterns are changing, ignoring the fact that human use rates are changing because of increasing temperatures, we will not have the rate of return that we expect on those resources. And public lands are probably one of the best insurance investments we have in maintaining all those ecosystem services for our country.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. And now the chair recognizes Ranking Member Mr. Young for 5-minute questions.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Cole, Patagonia, what do they sell?
So we're an outdoor clothing and gear company.
Okay, and where are most of those products made?
So we have a supply chain that is global in nature. We manufacture
Where are
products
they
around the
mostly
world.
made?
Across about 20 different countries, from the U.S.
Most
to
of them are
China
made
and
in
around
China.
the world.
I happen to go to your store, and the ironic part about it is most of your products are a result of fossil fuels. They're made by fossil fuels. The materials fossil fuels. They're made in China. The biggest polluter we have is China. And I often think it's hypocrisy to talk about we cannot use fossil fuels when the product they sell and advocate against is made by fossil fuels in China, not with American labor. I just wanted to bring that up. Dr. O'Neill, some environmental activists argue that fuel loads or too many trees are not a problem. However, in your testimony, you argued the epidemic of insects and disease in our western forests have been brought on in a large measure by an epidemic of too many trees. How does that work? Too many trees.
The work that myself and other scientists in that space, we work, as opposed to activists, we work as scientists. And so we look at the numbers and we look at the data. If you're wanting to mitigate fire impacts, you have to think about it within the framework of how does fire actually work. And it's real simple. You have what's called a fire triangle. You have fuels, oxygen, and heat. The only thing we can affect in the fire triangle is the fuels. The more fuel you have and the drier it is, which that will be exacerbated with warmer weather, drier weather, longer seasons. The more fuel you have, the more chance that when you get that lightning strike, when you get that ignition source, that you're going to end up with a catastrophic event. I mean, fire ecologists have been talking about this for 40 years, that this is a problem, and it's continuing to be a problem, and now we're seeing that it's a problem.
You bring up a very valid point for those members on the committee from California. When I was 5 years old, we were pasturing sheep in Paradise. My father and I had 5,000 ewes, and we didn't have any fires of any consequence because there was no overburden, no volatility that's left on the ground. And that, what I see now, when there is a fire, there's so much heat that it destroys the tree and actually destroys a lot of the ground, which probably would add later on with more trash timber than real timber. And I just, I watched that fire. By the way, how many acres did you burn? Anybody know? And anybody ever put a pencil to it? I'm going to get a science. How much pollution was put in the air by that fire? A lot. I think if they'd managed it to begin with, you wouldn't have had that fire. There's a big argument. Are we going to let the trees so be natural, or are we going to manage the timber? We have to manage the timber. But you mentioned cutting the tree, and we can't do that, including those people that sell goods made in China. You can't do it, but in reality, if we don't do it, we'll never address this issue. That's called adapting. That's all I ask you to think about, adapt. Just don't automatically say no. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Young. The chair now recognizes Mr. Raul Grijalva.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to you and to the members of this committee, thank you very much for the hearing. I want to associate myself with some of your comments at the outset, Madam Chair, and that was that, you know, climate change isn't just just in our jurisdiction, nor is it so that it is. I think it falls under the shared responsibility for all members, all decision makers, and I think this committee and the committee as a whole plays a big role, a very expansive role in addressing climate change, and within that jurisdiction, a very large nexus to be able to address those issues. And so I appreciate you mentioning that, because I think it's important to keep that in mind. Dr. Hansen, let me ask you, and both Dr. Gonzalez's work suggests that we need to protect more places from the dangers of climate change. An example that you could respond to, Dr. Hansen, is the Sky Islands along the southern border region in Arizona as a place for further protection. And can you speak about that specifically in terms of those Sky Islands being potential adaptation tools on the issue of climate change?
One of the effects of climate change that was alluded to in testimony today is about the movement of ecosystems and species in response to climate change. In order for that movement to happen, there has to be a place for that to happen. The Sky Islands region offers a unique suite of opportunity, because not only does it involve space that moves up in latitude to some degree, but it also creates elevational refugia, places that stay a little bit cooler, perhaps, as the overall landscape is changing, and places for things to move. Thinking about how we use the space we have to allow natural systems to respond to the extent they can by themselves in conditions like that is a vital component of adaptation. We do not have the money to help to hand manage all of the systems. We do not have the ability to move species manually. We need to come up with, how do we create an intact landscape across which things can move on their own?
Thank you very much. Mr. Cole, you know, based partly on Dr. Hansen's response and the testimony today, and as we talk about these efforts at adaptation, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, of which your organization and your business have been large supporters of, what role do you believe that plays in the discussion?
I think the Land and Water Conservation Fund is one of our most important conservation measures in the U.S. It has impacts in every single state, almost every single county across the country. And, you know, it takes this small amount of money from revenues from offshore drilling and leasing and puts that into conservation. And I think that whether you're living in, you know, in a community that has city parks, or whether you're living in a community that's close to a wilderness area, you could be helped by the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And with climate change, we need more of those protected spaces to allow for resilience, to allow for protection of biodiversity, to allow for carbon storage, all those things. Land and Water Conservation Fund can you know, contribute to all those benefits in the face of climate change.
And last, one more time, Dr. Hansen, you served on the Advisory Committee on Climate Change and Natural Resources Science under the previous administration. Let's take a snapshot of where we are right now in the last 2 years under this administration.
So unfortunately, that committee no longer exists.
Any action on the findings?
No, in fact, most of the suggestions that were made by that committee, the structures that were part of that set of ideas, that set of principles, no longer exist or are quite vestigial with no funding.
if you could respond, there was the beginning efforts of utilizing public lands as an adaptation vehicle going forward, and that has stopped as well. The issue then now becomes, are we contributing to the overall effect, negative effect of climate change as public lands, or retreating from any commitment to adaptation? Are we part of the problem now, or as opposed to being part of the solution?
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, the dominant contribution of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere from public lands is our use of them for the extraction of fossil fuels. And increasing that increases the problem, not only for all of us, but for public lands themselves. We need to be stopping climate change to save our public lands, not using our public lands to stop climate change, as a friend of mine would be paraphrased to say.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grijalva. The chair now recognizes Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I've read all of your testimonies last night, plus listened to your testimonies today. Dr. Gonzalez, I would like to commend you on the written testimony and the research behind the data that you presented, and Dr. O'Neill as well. I appreciate you bringing to the forefront things that need to be talked about as far as the benefits of healthy forests to helping our environment. Dr. Gonzalez, part of your testimony, you said prescribed burning is an adaptation measure that reduces future risk of catastrophic wildfire and tree death by removing an unnatural buildup of fuel in small trees where old policies suppressed natural wildfire. I agree with that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more about carrying capacity of land and how many trees per acre? Is it just small trees, or are there places where larger trees need to be removed and then do the controlled burning?
Well, the published scientific research shows that two major factors have caused the catastrophic wildfires that we're seeing. It's the old policies that have led to this unnatural accumulation of small trees and coarse woody debris, and then human-caused climate change has ignited that and doubled wildfire since 1984. So it's mainly the small trees and the coarse woody debris.
And I agree the suppression tactics over the decades have increased fire potential. Dr. O'Neill, would you like to talk about the carrying capacity, stems per acre or biomass per acre, and how that contributes to more fires?
Thank you. What we're dealing with in the western U.S. in particular, we've done some research looking at carrying capacity under these various alternative scenarios of a warmer and drier region. In 2010, we published this overarching document that looked at this carrying capacity issue and realized that going forward, we might end up losing 2, 3, or more species in particular areas because of increasing aridity. What that really means is that there isn't enough water there to sustain forests. As most people who live in the West know, you have forests in places where you have a little bit more moisture, and as soon as you leave those places and go into more arid regions, it turns into grassland. So we're seeing that.
I'm going to have to move on, but I appreciate you highlighting that part about the water. And I know there were questions about the role of land management and the roles of adaptation management, which gets into water and how important our healthy forests are for providing good water. But there's one thing that I think is confusing out there, and that's how managed forests help to sequester more carbon over the long run. I've got a slide I would like to put up. If the first one, it's very, very hard to see, especially at that scale, but basically the top chart shows an unmanaged forest over 160 years. The bottom chart shows a managed forest, and those curved lines are the amount of carbon stored over that time frame. That's a logarithmic scale, so that's actually 10 times more carbon on the bottom than on the top. And because when you use these wood products, you're storing the wood in buildings. If you look at non-managing the forest, the top chart, and the one in the middle is where you do harvest every 70 years, the one on the top does store more carbon, but the one on the bottom, because you're storing the carbon in buildings, and plus the amount of energy that it takes to produce wood versus other building materials, which that was alluded to, and if you'll put the next chart up there, this is another very hard to see chart, but the black line there in the middle, the large black line, that's the amount of cement that, on the first column, that China used in 2017. The very top one is how much the U.S. used. So China used 2.4 billion tons of cement in 2017. That's 3 times more than the U.S. used in the previous 10 years combined. And then we look at using wood in a building it takes 1.9 times more energy, more fossil fuels to produce concrete than it does to produce wood. So you get this huge cumulative effect globally when you substitute wood for other materials. Wish we had more time to talk about this. But I'm out.
Thank you, Mr. Westerman. Thank you. Thank you. The chair now recognizes Ms. DeGette.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and congratulations on your new position. I want to congratulate the chair on having her very first hearing as a hearing on climate change, which is so important for our public lands and for our country. I also sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and we had a hearing last week on climate change. I asked the panel a question that I'm going to also ask this panel here today vis-a-vis public lands. And it will require only a yes or no answer, so we'll start with you, Dr. Gonzalez. And the question is climate change real, largely due to human activity, a source of profound risk to the health, safety, and welfare of our country, including to our public lands, and something we urgently need to address, yes or no?
Yes.
Dr. Hansen?
Yes.
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Dr. O'Neill?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And as I said last week in Energy and Commerce, the very fact that we have a bipartisan panel here who all agrees with the basic foundation of what we need to address is actually a big step forward for Congress. And it gives me great hope that we can work in a bipartisan way on really addressing these issues. As a Westerner, I see the impacts on our public lands for myself. And I just have a few follow-up questions. Dr. Gonzalez, you testified that temperatures have increased in national parks more than other places. Could you briefly tell us why that is?
National parks are located in our most extreme environments, in the Arctic, in high elevation mountains, and in the arid Southwest. And those are the areas that climate change is exposing more, and that's where we've placed...
They're the most vulnerable areas, would that be?
Yeah, they're the most exposed, and America's most special places, the national parks, happen to be located in those extreme environments.
Dr. O'Neill, I wanted to talk with you about some issues because I think we agree on a lot, which is when you would have a forest, normally that would help offset carbon emissions. But as you accurately point out in your testimony, when you have massive forest fires, that increases carbon emissions. Would that be a fair assessment of your testimony?
That is a fair assessment.
Thank you.
The difficulty is that the global carbon budgets don't actually account emissions from public lands as something that's human-caused.
So
we get excluded.
We should probably fix that. But one of the things that you testified about is the increased vulnerability of our forests from issues of aridity and also things like insects, which we've seen in Colorado and throughout the rest of the Rocky Mountain West very dramatically the last few years. Scientists say that the reason why we've had the devastating pine beetle kill, for example, in our western forests, is in large part because of climate change, because it doesn't get cold enough in the winters anymore to kill the insects. Would you agree with that statement about pine beetles?
No.
You don't?
No, because that's the focus of my PhD, and in fact, in Colorado and the southern, the southern states, it's not colder winters, it's hotter summers.
Okay, but
That's
in
causing
any event, the hotter summers are due to climate impacts, correct?
Recall that when you see these changes.
You know what? I only have a minute left. Can you answer that yes or no?
There is that pattern that is in that system.
So I will say, if we address the climate issues, as Dr. Hansen was talking about, if we can keep climate change down below 2 degrees, that will help with the initial causes of the devastating forest fires that we have, as well as other issues. And that's what I think we need to look at. And one last thing I will say, I was just telling Congressman Huffman, forest management is really important in a lot of these areas. And to my view, one of the reasons why we've had such devastating fires is previous forest management plans where we didn't let naturally occurring fires burn. But now we have millions of acres in the West, millions of acres of public lands. The idea that we would harvest wood from these areas in order to have better forest management is just simply not tenable. We've got to work on a lot of other issues, and we've got to be practicable. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. DeGette. The chair now recognizes Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Today, we're engaging in, from my count at least, this committee's 5th hearing on anthropogenic climate change and the horrible consequences that will occur unless, of course, and this is my concern, unless we take action which includes massively expanding government, ultimately destroying federalism and restricting individual liberties. And I go back and look at the first 5 hearings of the 115th Congress that this committee had, and it included modernizing water and power infrastructure, improving infrastructure for tribal and insular communities, examining management of marine sanctuaries, improving infrastructure for National Park Service and Forest Service, and how best to use our natural raw materials for national security. But today, again, if my count is correct, we have the 5th hearing in this time in National Parks, Forests, and Public Land Subcommittee is what amounts to me as a publicity stage for the Green New Deal, which is championed by many of my colleagues across the aisle. And this resolution, which of course was named, at least recalls the name from FDR's New Deal, which arguably intended to put Americans back to work, this resolution does just the opposite. In fact, one really has to wonder in looking at the details of this whether or not there will actually be new regulations that would be created regarding the manner in which we breathe because of the carbon dioxides that we ourselves produce. This deal calls for a massive mobilization of resources that could be more appropriately used to pay down $11.6 billion in Park Service maintenance backlog, which of course Chairman Grijalva and Republican leader Bishop in a bipartisan manner put forth last Congress in the Restore Our Parks Act. And, you know, I can't recall the number of times that I've heard from my colleagues across the aisle talking and complaining about how offshore oil rigs, so far off they can't even be seen, and yet they ruin our environment. But this Democratic plan has been produced. It would now call for hundreds of thousands of square miles of wind turbines and solar panels More precisely, a 2015 study by Stanford engineers noted that to meet the nation's power needs entirely with clean energy would require almost 500,000 on and offshore wind turbines and over 75 million solar panels, and would cost roughly $7 trillion. All of this new infrastructure would somehow, amazingly, not run into any problems with the Endangered Species Act or Clean Waters Act, and environmental impact studies would apparently just sail right through the approval process, although we've had in this committee countless times witnesses testify that oftentimes we're looking at a 7 to 10 year average of getting some of these permits. This is potentially, I would say, the Green New Deal's only winning strategy, which I would assume supporters on the other side would aggressively help to overhaul some of the ridiculous, burdensome hoops that must be jumped through, and I would certainly welcome that conversation. But overall, I'm extremely disappointed with the direction of this committee and the subcommittees in these first few weeks of business. It seems to have taken the very important issue we have of managing the American people's natural resources and disguised the committee as one focused on climate alarmism. No doubt, clean air, clean water, healthy environment are important issues, one that I certainly want to help pass on to my children and my grandchildren, but so is the business of managing our federal lands and parks and making sure that we're focused on the issues like the national parks maintenance, backlog, and a host of other issues. This is an immediate concern to the function of these parks so that they continue to be enjoyed. So my hope is that we will come back to, in the near future, this committee's agenda to match more closely the mission and our jurisdiction, and that we would get away from these continued rainbow and unicorn promises of a fairyland Green New Deal. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Heiss. The chair now recognizes Mr. Neguse.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and also congratulations to you on your election, and appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing, and the fact that this first hearing of the subcommittee is on such an important issue and as existential issue as climate change. I would just say, with respect to my colleague on the other side of the aisle, I respectfully disagree in the framing of this hearing as a publicity stage or a publicity stunt, something to that effect. I think this hearing is an opportunity for members of this committee to hear from some world-renowned experts and scientists in their respective fields, both witnesses from the majority and the minority. And I've appreciated, actually, the give and take and some of the thoughtful questions with respect to forest management and so forth. So I think that this could hardly be described as a publicity stage, that this is, in fact, an important subcommittee hearing on the defining issue of our time, which is the planetary crisis that we find ourselves in. I found, Dr. Hansen, your testimony very compelling with respect to your comment about testifying in 2004. As I mentioned at the last full committee meeting, my wife and I are new parents. I have a 6-month-old, or she's 5 months, 2 weeks old, Natalie, our daughter. And I think a lot about the work that we do here in the context of the world that she will inherit when some of the most catastrophic consequences of climate change are set to occur. If the IPCC report, and of course we have several members of the IPCC here with us today, my daughter will be 12 years old, 13 years old. And so it really brings into clarity just how important the work is that this committee is undertaking. So I appreciate the chairwoman holding the hearing and the members participating, and of course the witnesses for joining us today. I want to ask a question of Dr. Gonzalez. You referenced Rocky Mountain National Park. I happen to represent the great state of Colorado, northern Colorado, Boulder, Fort Collins, and Rocky Mountain National Park. I've spent my life as a child and a young adult, and of course now as a father, going to the park and enjoying the park as so many countless Americans do. You talked a lot about the consequences just in terms of how our national parks are faring as a result of climate change, including Rocky Mountain National Park. I guess I'm wondering if you can put a finer point on what we are to expect in the coming years if we don't take decisive action. I mean, I agree with Dr. Hansen that inaction is just simply not an option, but I am curious if you could provide sort of some additional details about just how dire the consequences will be for our national parks.
Yes, Rocky Mountain actually has experienced historically some of the more severe impacts of climate change, the increased wildfire, the bark beetle kill, which across the western U.S. has been the most severe in 125 years, and the reduction of snow cover. If we don't reduce carbon emissions from human activities, wildfire could substantially increase. Published research estimates in Yellowstone an increase of 300 to 1,000%. And with the increased aridity and the increase in bark beetles, more massive tree death, tree mortality across the western U.S. In addition, the wildlife, right now in Yosemite National Park, historically wildlife have been shifting upslope following the cooler temperatures. That shifting might go off the top of mountains, and in Lassen Volcanic National Park, the American pike, a small mammal, might completely lose its habitat and locally disappear.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. My next question is for Mr. Cole. I want to thank you for your testimony and certainly for your leadership. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to the extent that you would like to the ranking member of the subcommittee's comments with respect to your company and manufacturing and so forth. My understanding is Patagonia was a founding member of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition and does quite a bit in that regard, and so I just want to make sure you have an opportunity to respond to the extent you'd like to.
Thank you. I appreciate that. In regards to our company's activities and our approach to this problem, we have a goal of being carbon neutral by 2025. This is in alignment with 40 years of our work around sustainability, as you note, and we're working hard across our entire supply chain to make that happen. We do make products around the world in about 20 different countries. We also are proud to make products in the United States, and we support about 1,500 to 2,000 jobs in the U.S., depending on the season. We're proud of those employees and that contribution to our economy here. We're also a part of an $887 billion industry, the outdoor recreation economy, that is present in the United States and supports about 7.6 million U.S. jobs, direct jobs that derive directly from the protection of our public lands and from having a climate that supports the kind of lifestyle and economy that we're used to. So I would say internationally that having a global supply chain is an advantage for us in understanding this global problem. And we are working with our suppliers in China, frankly, and other places around the world to also address these key issues. Climate is not just a problem for our country, but it's a global problem as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cole. Thank you, Mr. Neguse.
Thank you. Yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I, with my colleagues, would like to express my appreciation for the opportunity to talk about this important topic. If any of you have been to Utah, you'll understand why I believe Utahns have it in their DNA to be good stewards of this earth. Comes quite naturally. As a Boy Scout, I was taught to leave my campground cleaner than I found it. And I actually believe that both Republicans and Democrats believe that to be true. I regret the stereotypes that are often formed around this issue. Somehow all Republicans hate the environment and all Democrats are alarmist. And I don't believe either of those stereotypes are true. I hope we can find common ground as we talk. You've heard from a lot of my colleagues today how important the forests are in this issue. I'd like to add to that clean air and natural disaster resiliency. I think it's a mistake not to be talking about resiliency to these natural disasters. There's been, interestingly, something, in my opinion, that's been totally missed in our dialogue today and is almost always missed in this dialogue in Washington, D.C., and that's the impact of local and state governments and elected officials. I believe, personally, having been a former mayor, that if you want to reduce it by 2 degrees, mayors know how to solve this. And I think it's a mistake when we feel like there's somehow one magic fix at the federal level that we can mandate in a one-size-fits-all to solve this problem. And I want to give you a quick example. In Utah, in Salt Lake City, in Utah County, we have a unique problem that we're surrounded by mountains on all sides. And particularly in the winter months, we get what's called an inversion, where a high-pressure system comes in and traps the air in those valleys. And therefore, if you ask Utahns what the largest environmental crisis is, they'll say clean air. And they'll say it about 15 times a year. Otherwise, we enjoy beautiful mountain clean air. In response to this, our governor, in his last State of the Union just several weeks ago, increased the money in his budget, not 2 times, not 3 times, but 117 times for clean air. Introducing initiatives with transit, and we have a big issue with wood-burning stoves, and that was a big part of it. Electrical vehicle charging stations, and things like that were part of his plan. I mentioned that I was mayor before I came here, and our city recognized the need to take responsibility, and we produced something called the Provo Clean Air Toolkit. The name of the city is Provo. I would also invite all of you to Provo, and I would hope that you would all search on the internet for the Provo Clean Air Toolkit, and in it, I think you'll see a masterful plan for cities about what individuals can do, what municipal government can do, what colleges can do, what businesses can do to improve air quality. We also introduced transit. We worked on walking and biking. As the mayor, I committed to ride my bike to work 100 times in a given year to try to inspire my residents to do the same. We introduced renewables we're a municipal power city. We were 70% coal when I took over. We introduced renewables and gave our residents a chance to buy as much as 100% of their energy from renewables. And one fun thing that we did is we also recognized no matter what we did as a government, unless the hearts and minds of our residents were in tune with this need, that we could accomplish nothing. So we came up with what we call the Provo Clean Air Challenge, Pledge. And we had several points that we challenged our residents to do. We asked them to carpool as much as possible. We have a unique situation in Utah where you can find a church house on almost every corner, and most of us live within walking distance of that church. Embarrassingly, the Curtis family sometimes will take 3 cars to that church 3 or 4 blocks away, and we're not the only ones. And so challenging my residents to carpool when it was appropriate. Park and ride instead of going into a drive-up restaurant was on the list. Not letting your vehicle idle for more than 30 seconds. And ride or bike or carpool and use public transit wherever possible. So today I invite all of my colleagues to take this challenge, and I have for you a pin that we wear on our lapel pin in Provo, if any of you feel so inclined to take that personal responsibility. Thank you, Madam Chairman. The very first one I've given out in Washington, D.C. But before my time expires, I would just like to really emphasize how important it is that, first of all, as a member of Congress, we personally are doing what we can do before we ask other people to do it. Are we changing our light bulbs? Are we not using plastic bags and all of those things? And the second thing is to remember the power of local government in solving this problem and make sure that we're empowering them and not ignoring them. Thank you very much. I yield my time. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Curtis. I walk to work every day, just letting you know that. And I haven't used a plastic disposable water bottle since I've been here on Capitol Hill. So thank you so much, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Case.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. O'Neill and Dr. Gonzalez, I've got 2 questions, one for each of you, both sides of the same coin. I'll give them to you both up front. And Dr. O'Neill, I'll start with kind of a very abbreviated story from my own home state of Hawaii, where the indigenous peoples of Hawaii, the Native Hawaiians, lived for generations and generations in isolation, no contact, very ecologically and environmentally balanced and sustainable society. And then what happened was the first Western ships brought with them rats. And the rats wreaked havoc on the local wildlife and also on human beings. And so therefore, we imported the mongoose from India to take care of the rats. Well, the mongoose started killing off the fowl population, and they went from hero to enemy. And so we brought in something else to take care of the mongoose, and et cetera, et cetera. You can see that sometimes the best intentions of humans are not as good as what nature wrote to start with. And I say that by way of asking you this question. When I hear your testimony, what I hear you saying is that, hey, we've got a climate change problem. We've got incredible risk to our public lands, to include our forests, and obviously that is creating a number of problems, whether it be wildfires or whether it be the lack of a natural solution to climate change and CO2 emissions. But the way to do that is to harvest the forest. And I just pause on that when I think about it from a science perspective, because you're asking me to really say that my solution to the problem I had in Hawaii was to introduce another human solution, when the problem was the rat coming in to start with. The problem was climate change to start with. And so I just ask you to comment on, are you saying that the out in terms of the impact of climate change on our public lands is to enhance harvesting, or is it a human solution? I'm just having I'm not a scientist, I'm not a climate scientist, but I'm a skeptic of that position, as opposed to just going back to a more natural cycle. I'm sorry, and Dr. Gonzalez, the flip side is there a way to manage our forests that helps climate change, okay?
So I think that the challenge is do nothing or log it to the beach. And that's not actually an alternative that you would look at in terms of the national forests, which is where I've done a lot of this analysis and work. Those are areas that are available, they're considered timberlands, and there are a lot of different alternatives of the way that you would treat those forests to get to a condition that was more fire resilient. Like the example that you just explained, and I was just in Hawaii at Christmas, so I got this story of the errors of the Mongoose Way. But the idea that we could, if we just leave it to nature, everything would be wonderful, would suggest that we haven't spent 40 or 50 years doing fire suppression, and therefore the historic fire return interval would be such that we would get back to a natural condition. And because we're so far out of sync, that's not actually possible.
So you're saying we're out of sync because of human, are you saying that we're out of sync because of human-caused management and we have to get back into sync by human ways?
It's a combination of all of those things. It's a combination of the management decisions that were made in the last 100 years, including stopping all fires by 10 a.m.
Okay.
And the recognition of that, probably, like I said, for the past 30 or 40 years, fire ecologists have saying, we're going to have a problem, we're going to have a problem.
Okay,
and now we have a problem.
Okay, I get it. I appreciate your answer. That was an honest answer. Dr. Gonzalez, what do you think? Can we handle climate change in some forest management way to include harvesting, continued harvesting? What does that do?
Published scientific research by my colleagues at University of California, Berkeley, in Yosemite National Park and elsewhere, shows that prescribed burning and the use of wildland fire can effectively restore ecosystem function to our forests, and that it reduces risks of high-severity fire in the future, improves their resilience to drought, and improves soil moisture. Also, fire is more efficient, cost-effective, and environmentally sound than timber harvesting or thinning. I'd underline also that prescribed burning also results in long-term accumulation of carbon, which naturally reduces climate change. And the way it does that is you remove the small trees and the large trees get larger. And over the long term, the research shows that the large trees will store more carbon than you release in the short-term burns.
Okay. I'm out of time, so I'm not gonna do this. So you're saying, just briefly, yes, there are appropriate forest management techniques that actually help climate change.
Yes, prescribed burn and wildland fire.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Case. The chair recognizes Mr. Bishop.
Thank you. Dr. Neal, I appreciate you not speaking glittering generalities, but I got 1 minute to ask this question and have it answered. It was traditionally, forests are thought of as carbon sink to suck up carbon. Instead, they are now emitting it. Are there, in your opinion, some creative ways of forest resiliency that we could use for these extreme events that we've had? Like I say, 41 seconds, go for it.
There are a number of examples that are occurring here. There's an example in Arizona where they're looking at forest restoration. They remove the trees. They have to find a market for them. Unfortunately, there are no markets to be found. And part of their requirement is actually to do the fire risk reduction and get rid of all the biomass before they can move on to the next area. And I think this is important. When you harvest, you also have to treat those residues through, usually through some kind of a fire effort. Now, the challenge is...
I'm sorry. Let me go on with this. So you're talking about there are practices, but they also have to have some private sector economy to make them functionable at the same time.
Absolutely.
All right. Mr. Cole, I appreciate the fact that you were here when none of your company actually was going to attend last year, so thank you for accepting a Democrat invitation. I think it clearly illustrates how crony capitalism was working very well in the last administration and may do it again in the future. I've been reading in Matthew about how Christ and John talked about the hypocrites, except the word hypocrite comes from a Greek word which actually is better translated as a play actor. There are roles people are playing, and I think we have roles that people are playing here. Now, the slur against Patagonia is it's Patagonia made in China because that's what all the labels say. I want everyone to know that's not true. I cleaned out my closet and found a vest that was purchased from Patagonia, so I looked at the label, and it was not made in China. It was made in Sri Lanka. So the $900 billion industry you're talking about, which is a slight exaggeration, is basically there to improve the bottom line, not necessarily improve the planet. So for example, the stuff that is made in China by your company clearly put out the statement that we've made the choice not to disengage with countries on the basis of their policies. Wish you would do that in the United States as well. But amongst those policies in which the company now wishes to ignore is the internment, re-education of over 1 million Uyghur Muslims, routine jailing of environmental activists and civil rights campaigners, destroying over 3,000 acres of coral reefs in the South China Sea with runways, ports, and military facilities, subsidizing long-range commercial fishing fleets that threaten the viability of fishing around the world, providing $36 billion in financing to developing countries for the construction of over 102 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants. In addition, just the Patagonia businesses in China, 65% of all those businesses are run on coal. If you'd actually done your work in America, the average in the United States is only 37%, which would be a lot nicer. Now, in addition to that, the testimony you've given here has a whole bunch of false narratives in there. If I read the paragraph you said simply about Bears Ears and Grand Staircase, but specifically Bears Ears, administration's actions not only rob Native Americans, which is false, and all Americans of their natural and cultural heritage, false, threaten communities that depend on outdoor industries for economic survival, false, poison our air and water, false, wreck untold damage on vulnerable species, false, exacerbate climate change, false, and open up public lands to more extraction. Mr. Curtis, if I can yield to you for a second. You had a bill to actually legalize the Bears Ears situation and create it the proper way. Did you open up extraction in the area that was no longer part of the Bears Ears monument that was done, unfortunately, by President Obama in Hawaii?
I regret that because of the anger in that area, nobody realized that my bill did more to protect the land than President Obama's designation. There was a mineral withdrawal throughout the entire area that President Obama had designated.
All right, we'll get this in 40 seconds, 50 seconds or less. Did you ban extraction?
Yes.
Why?
It's the right thing to do.
And was there any potential of extraction in that entire area?
No.
So that's why we were able to do it. Actually, the Association Patagonia Leads was organized to avoid paying taxes so that you can get the taxpayer to fund all these programs to exist with your bottom line. I am pleased that on the tax break that you got $10 million and you decided to put that into politics. Had you done that into something in actually enhancing the backlog problem we have in maintenance, that could have been real and that could have been something specific and that could have been happily there. Madam Chairman, I've got 15 seconds. I want to congratulate you. You are the only member on your side that has not gone over the 5-minute limit. In fact, so far, everyone totals 2 minutes and 44 seconds. We should get another speaker on our side just to do that. But I appreciate the fact there's a 5-minute limit. I'm quitting.
You're amazing. Thank you very much, Mr. Bishop. The chair now recognizes Mr. Horsford.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And it gives me great honor to say that, and I'm very pleased to be on this committee. Not to belabor the comments that were just made, I'd like to divert back to the interest from my home state of Nevada, which depends heavily on public lands and has a long-standing partnership with government agencies that we work to both manage and protect the public lands in partnership together. In fact, my district, Nevada's 4th Congressional District, is home to Great Basin National Park, Death Valley National Park, Lake Mead National Recreation Area, as well as Gold Butte Basin and Range, and Tule Springs National Monument, something that I'm proud to have worked with the ranking member Bishop in prior congressional sessions. Nevada's 4th Congressional District is also home to 3 national forests, which span more than 3.5 million acres. In total, Nevada has more than 59 million acres of public lands. 86% of our state is made up of public land managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and other federal agencies. Nevada's public lands provide unparalleled outdoor recreational opportunities for the people of Nevada and the visitors to our state. In 2017 alone, the National Park Service accommodated more than 6 million visits to Nevada's parks. And in 2017, visitors to land managed by the National Park Service spent more than $250 million supporting 3,281 jobs. Sadly, due to the impacts of climate change, Nevada's public lands face ever-increasing list of threats. In recent years, rising temperatures have allowed the bark beetle to multiply faster, putting more forest area at risk of infestation. Now, the bark beetle may not sound too threatening to some, but as it continues to infest our forest, it will substantially increase the forest fires and threaten the health of Nevada's national forest. Climate change continues to contribute to longer wildfire seasons in Nevada. And we've also seen a decline in our water rates at the Lake Mead National Recreational Area. All the impacts of climate change increase in scope and severity. Managers of public lands will continue to face increased challenges. So, Dr. Gonzalez, your research spoke to the disproportionate impacts of climate change on national parks in the Southwest. And I'd like to ask if you could, if we allow climate change to continue unabated, what will this mean for districts like mine?
Already, in Lake Mead National Recreation Area, in your district, climate change has combined with increased water withdrawals from cities and agriculture to lower the level of the lake to its lowest level since it was filled in the 1930s. That's in part due to a drought in the southwestern U.S. That published research has shown has been caused by human-caused climate change since 2000 and is ongoing. Continued climate change could continue to reduce water flow in the Colorado River, which threatens the level of the lake, which not only provides for the ecosystems in the area, but sustains the people of southern Nevada.
Thank you. And Mr. Cole, can you explain how the threats outlined by Mr. Gonzalez might impact outdoor recreation on our public lands?
Absolutely. And first off, Nevada is a very important state for us. We'll have upwards of 1,000 employees as of the end of this year. And
we appreciate your contribution to our state and the creation of those jobs.
Thank you. and thanks for your leadership. And those employees, you know, for a business, we need to attract employees like that to our locations, to places like our distribution center in Reno, Nevada. And we can't do that without an attractive state to bring them into. And part of the attraction, as you've just noted, about Nevada are its public lands. It has incredible places for people to come and recreate, spend time outdoors. And so it's an attractive thing for a business like ours. I think that's the case for businesses across the spectrum in outdoor recreation, whether it's small mom and pop businesses on a local level that rely on protected places for their business and to bring people in, or larger ones like ours. So it's a huge economic impact for sure.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Thank you, Mr. Horsford. The chair recognizes Mr. Fulker.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and panel, thank you for being here. I have a question for Dr. O'Neill, but I need to set the stage for that. So, because I think, from what I'm hearing, the situation in our state of Idaho is different than what I'm hearing from my colleagues. But in our state, we've got approximately 2/3 of our land is federal land, and so we're really tenants there instead of landlords in that sense. And the problem is that our landlord's about $22 trillion in debt, and they don't have the ability to manage what's there, so they don't. And so in a given year, we'll burn up about, just in the forest areas, about 500,000 acres if you want to average it out over time. And that's kind of turned into kind of a worst of all worlds scenario, because the wildlife gets decimated in that circumstance. The tons of carbon emissions get kicked up into the air. We will collectively, state, federal, spend six-digit millions in trying to suppress it, but it just, when it's not managed at all, there's just this fuel load that builds up so much that a lightning strike, boom, hits it, and then it's decimated for our wildlife, our sportsmen, our timber industry, all of that. And so what's left of our timber industry, what's left of our sportsmen, our recreationalists, and our farmers, our ranchers, they would just like to engage in some fashion to try to put some wisdom, and that's all, just wisdom into how that land is managed, the land that's within our state borders. From your perspective and your homework, what are the biggest obstacles and some of the things that we might be able to do, just simply to take the stakeholders who live there, who want to take care of it, to have a little bit more say in how that's done?
In Washington State, we've adopted an all lands, all hands approach, where you're systematically looking at these very high-risk areas, including state, private, and federal land and tribal lands, and looking at how it is that we could create these large areas that have some resilience in them. That's sort of a shared stewardship model. They work very closely with the U.S. Forest Service to try to accomplish that kind of effort. But it wouldn't happen without on-the-ground forest collaboratives. In Washington State, we have a large number of forest collaboratives that very much speak to that local input and local outcomes. I would suggest that's a model that's usable in almost every area. They use it in Arizona, they use it in Washington State, where they're actually looking at ways that the local people can get their needs addressed and also public-private relationships, because obviously the Forest Service or any other public agency is not in the business of marketing any kind of material that they remove, and that you do need markets to be able to sustain this stuff. We've had stewardship contracts for years, and the difficulty is being able to actually market the material, and therefore nobody bids on it, or they don't bid enough to do the work to actually create this really significant change. So it's a systemic challenge, especially if you lose your infrastructure.
Thank you, Dr. O'Neill, and Madam Chair. Just a closing statement. And I really do appreciate the perspective of the panelists. And I would just invite you, if you really believe that fires in their natural state and just leaving things alone is the best thing to do for the environment, then I would just encourage you, during fire season, when we are pumping tons of carbon into the air and spending hundreds of millions to try to suppress it, I would encourage you just to come visit. We live there. It's our home. And we just want to take care of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Folker. The chair now recognizes Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and the witnesses for being here. You know, I've sat here through this, listening to this, and I really think it reflects the fact that, you know, later on we're going to be voting about a package to keep the government open or not, and may have some issues later on around the president thinking about a national emergency. What we're talking about here is the national emergency that the nation confronts and the planet confronts. And so I'm really glad to be part of this hearing and listen to it. Yesterday we held hearings in Natural Resources Committee on the Energy and Mineral Resources Subcommittee, where, again, as witnesses have pointed out, 25% of our nation's energy sources, oil, gas, coal, and then also renewables, come from federal lands. That's all the offshore, all the onshore that are under the control of the federal government, about 25%. So I think that's a great discussion. And, you know, we've heard from some of the witnesses. I'm going to ask all the witnesses to really answer 3 questions. Should we be now placing a moratorium on issuing any new permits or any new leases for onshore and offshore oil, gas, and coal? Should we also look at, on existing extraction, to place a fee or a tax on fossil fuel extraction to fund some of the impacts of climate change? Should those that are contributing now, should we be looking at that? And if we are going to fund some of the impacts, what would you set up as our priorities from some kind of fee on oil extraction or carbon fee, but from federal lands? How would you spend as your highest priority in terms of some of the impacts? I'm going to go right across, start with Dr. Gonzalez. First question, should we place a moratorium on all now new development on federal lands?
The scientific research clearly shows that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels, and moving to renewable solar, wind, and energy conservation and energy efficiency is the way to do that. Many policy mechanisms to do that, and the one that you've identified is one of them. It's not in my particular area of expertise to judge that moratorium, but anything that moves us away from fossil fuels is good.
Okay, Dr. Hansen, should we be placing a moratorium on all new development, permits, leases?
If our bottom line goal is to stop making this problem worse, I would say that would be a prudent course of action, especially when the injury from the action affects the very place from which that energy is being extracted.
Thank you. Mr. Cole.
Yes, we've already been pretty public in stating that for offshore drilling, we believe very firmly that a moratorium should be in place. And similarly for onshore, I think it's a prudent action to proceed that way.
And Dr. Oser.
That
Dr.
onshore and
O'Neill.
offshore oil and gas is outside of my realm of expertise as a scientist. I'm going to decline that one.
Okay. What about should we be using on existing oil extraction, which is approximately 25% of the nation's oil, gas, and coal, should we be having some kind of fee or extraction to really begin to pay for some of the both short-term and long-term impacts? And if it's so, what are the kinds of impacts, whether it's environmental, whether it's economic development, transitions, labor disruptions? How would we, if we begin to do this, how should we begin to use some of the resources? And then anybody can jump in, because we're going to have to prioritize. First of all, is there a cost to carbon extraction? And should they be part of the solution by helping to fund impacts?
You know, again, clearly the research shows that the real cost of fossil fuels, the social cost of carbon, has not been reflected in the price, the environmental impacts and the social costs. So any policy that can integrate that real social cost of carbon into fossil fuel use would be a good advance.
Anybody else? I think I'm running out of time.
I would just like to quickly say that solving the problem of climate change is addressing the need for fiscal prudence. The cost of the impacts of climate change is already upon us. We've already talked about a lot of the effects that have been seen in everybody's home states. What that will mean if it continues unchecked for our economy is catastrophic. Coming up with ways that we create market incentives to move us away from that and toward the economy of the future, I think is vital. I am not an economist, so I don't know what the best mechanisms are, but we certainly do need to account for those costs.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. The chair now recognizes the acting chair. And I allowed a little extra time there. Unlike Ranking Member Bishop, who did a great job bringing his comments in precisely within the time limit, however, I think he may have exceeded the limit of reasonable credibility with some of that anger and sanctimony directed at Patagonia. It seems that all of this anger and passion about doing business with China and other countries for clothing is reserved for companies that want to protect public lands and national monuments and do something about climate change and be good corporate citizens. I wish we had more even-handed sanctimony that applied to the Trump family. After all, these are the biggest hypocrites of all. They attend their MAGA rallies. They whip people into a nationalist fervor, railing against doing business and trade with China, and then they turn around and do exactly that. So I hope we can not only honor time limits, but also honor even-handedness in our sanctimony as we go forward. I was pleased by the other side's calling a witness to this hearing, the first time, I believe, in any of our Natural Resource Subcommittee hearings, Dr. O'Neill, who firmly reflects the mainstream of the global scientific community in acknowledging climate change. I'm getting a little whiplash because we've heard previous witnesses that tell us no big deal, nothing to see here. But Dr. O'Neill, I found your testimony refreshing and welcome. The only piece that I wanted to push back on a little is the notion that we might be able to log ourselves out of this problem or log ourselves even to fire resilience. I represent a lot of forest land and a lot of public land that has much in common with some of my Republican colleagues. And I'm glad you clarified a little bit that you're not talking about logging all the way to the beach. So I appreciated that comment very much that you made. But I think it's important to acknowledge, because I live this reality too, that the 2017 North Bay fires and last year's Mendocino Complex fire, which devastated parts of my district, burned primarily in chaparral. These were not large standing, merchantable trees. 60% of wildfires occur on chaparral and grassland, so they're not going to be stopped by logging. They're not going to be stopped even by many conventional fuels reduction projects. And these fires also are exceptional because of weather events, high winds, dry ground, all of these factors, not simply this simplistic notion that we don't cut enough trees. And so that's why many of us want to prioritize mitigation projects in and around at-risk communities, ensuring that those communities have the resource and guidance that they need to establish fire-safe neighborhoods. That's smart fire resiliency. But you might be surprised, Dr. O'Neill, I think if you and I sat in a room, we would agree on a lot of things where we can do more cutting of trees and more harvesting. And we can do it thoughtfully with shaded fuel breaks. We can do thinning of some of these second and third growth plantation stands that are extreme risks for catastrophic fires. So I don't want to suggest that we're totally on opposite pages or that the choice is to discontinue all harvesting or just open the doors to unlimited harvesting with impunity. I think there's a lot of common ground that we can work on together. Now, Dr. Gonzalez, we've heard at length about logging to reduce fuel loads, and I want to ask you, does the best available science suggest that commercial logging in this fashion is a silver bullet to reduce fire risk?
The published scientific research shows the opposite. It's that preemptively using fire management, prescribed burning, and wildland fire is the way to restore ecosystem integrity to our forests and to reduce high-severity fire in the future.
Okay, Mr. Cole, I know Patagonia is based in Ventura, close to where the devastating Thomas Fire burned hundreds of thousands of acres around Ventura. Was this the fire in an unthinned tree stand?
No, those fires, which did impact us heavily, we had over half of our employees evacuated at given times over the past couple of years. That was in exactly the kind of habitat you described, which is chaparral. It's coastal scrub. You know, a policy to log more and that, you know, would not have helped that area at all.
Okay, moving to a different subject, we've talked a lot about our public lands being a great asset for this country and a contributor to emissions, but they can also be part of the solution through carbon sequestration, soil health, and other factors. Can you speak very briefly about regenerative agriculture and healthy soils on our public lands as a strategy to reduce emissions?
Yeah, so this is another sort of pillar of our policy and approach around addressing the climate crisis, is regenerative organic agriculture. The concept is one that goes back literally thousands of years. It's a sort of low-till, no-till crop rotation orientation to agriculture that has huge benefits in storing carbon in the soil. And we know that simply cutting back on fossil fuels and shifting to renewables is not enough. We've got to store carbon. So this is a great approach.
I apologize that I don't have more time because we deserve to have a longer conversation about that subject, but we're out of time. Mr. Westerman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate.
We've reached the end.
Okay, I thought we were doing a second round.
We're going to do a second round? The chair agreed to this. Oh, the chair's here, man.
We've still got time on the clock.
I'm happy to. Let me leave that tough decision to the chair, though.
Thank you so much. I wanted to go until noon. We have 10 minutes, so we have time for 2 more questions, one on your side and one on ours. How's that? If you would like to go over your time, I am more than happy to accommodate you. Okay, thank you.
We're burning them now.
Exactly, Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you doing a second round. I think Southerners should be given more minutes. I think we're being discriminated against because of our slow cadence in speaking, but we'll try to get more questions in this time. I would like to make a bit of a clarification. I think we have to distinguish between public lands and federal lands. We have the national parks and we have the Forest Service, which I think are 2 land bases that should be managed differently. Dr. Gonzalez, I know you talked about Yellowstone. I got to spend some time in Yellowstone. I never realized before going out there just how much of a lodgepole pine cohort is in Yellowstone, which we know has about a 100-year life expectancy until you get a stand replacing fire. I think the one in the 80s took out about half of Yellowstone. It's going to burn. I don't think we need to manage on Yellowstone. We can let nature manage Yellowstone. That's what's been going on there. And there's other places on our national parks where I've never promoted doing intensive management on those parks. There could be stuff in the wildland-urban interface. But the Forest Service is a different story. And I would like to just go back briefly to my previous testimony where I had the chart up that showed that active management plus using wood materials overall is a bigger carbon sink, better for the environment than just a hands-off approach to management. And I want to ask the scientist, Dr. Gonzalez, do you agree with that assessment? That management plus using wood materials is better than non-management?
prescribed burning, again, has been shown to increase carbon storage in forests more than mechanical thinning.
Dr.
Could I ask if Mr. Westerman would yield just for a clarification of his question? And I'll give you all of my time as far as I'm concerned.
All right, I'll yield to the gentleman.
I'm just wondering if you're asking categorically across the board, because sometimes we talk as if all forests and all fires are the same, and they're just
No,
not.
I'm not talking across
Okay.
the board, but in areas where we can actively manage, where we produce wood products, we build wood buildings, build furniture, the research shows that overall is better for the environment than no management at all. And I'm just asking if you agree with that research or do you disagree with it?
Storage and harvested wood products can increase carbon storage. But again, the point I was making was the difference between prescribed burning, proactive fire management versus logging and thinning. And it's the proactive fire management that has been shown.
I need to move on, Dr. Hanna.
My area of expertise is not forest dynamics. However, what I do know is that if, in fact, you want to have forest products in order to be harvested, we need to start managing our forest systems for future conditions. Otherwise, we will end up with not...
Agree that the adaptive management...
We need to undertake adaptation principles, yes.
And Dr. O'Neill.
I've worked extensively in this area. In fact, some of the published research quantifies those differences in just leaving the forest alone or managing it for wood products to both store the carbon in the wood and store and offset the use of other materials like steel and concrete. So yes, I do agree with that.
Okay, and Madam Chair, I would like to submit for the record the charts that I put up that were so hard to read. They did come from this graduate level textbook called Global Resources and the Environment by Chad Oliver, who's a professor at Yale University, and I would like to submit those for the record that show that managing forest and using wood products are better for the environment.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Dr. O'Neill, you also supplied this chart that shows federal lands, forests on the federal lands have a higher mortality rate than a growth rate, which is very concerning. Contrary to that, in my state of Arkansas, we produce 16 million more tons of wood per year every year, and with your data of 50% of that's carbon, we're actually sinking 8 million more tons of carbon per year in the state of Arkansas. The state of Georgia, it's 9.5 million tons of carbon more per year that's going into a sink. Should states like Arkansas who have healthy forests be rewarded for that versus states who have, or the federal government that have forests that are, have higher mortality and are emitting more carbon, storing less carbon? Should they be punished?
I'm not into the punishment
That maybe wasn't the right word.
Here.
Should there be more incentives for states like Arkansas that are sequestering more carbon?
I think the incentive is to promote and support a forest sector that will encourage that investment in growing forests and using them for harvested wood products, and then using those harvested wood products, as many of them as possible, in long-lived products. Certainly in the Southeast, we have a really vibrant forest industry, and actually that same report that looked at the national forests and the level of mortality also speaks to the fact that in the Southeast U.S., there are more acres under management, and they're harvesting more than they ever have, but yet they're carrying more than they ever had because there's investment, because there's a market, and that market promotes the reinvestment in forestry. We also see that in the Pacific Northwest in the coastal areas, where you have a lot of private forest land, and the investment supports the idea of continued forest management. When we lose that market, we lose the investment potential, we lose the potential to use those lands to sequester carbon and then produce wood products. It's different calculus.
Thank you, Dr. O'Neill. Thank you, Dr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman. And I'd like to make note that we did yield to your Southern cadence, so thank you for bringing that up.
And Madam Chair, would you please deduct Mr. Westerman's extra time from mine, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. I will ask the last question of this hearing, and my question goes to Dr. Hansen. The first is a yes/no question. The second one, we all ask you to expand on the answer. In your testimony, you mentioned that we need to provide our agencies with clear, informed mandates to begin preparing for climate change. In your opinion, has this administration provided these?
No.
And what should we be requiring our agencies to do?
It should be a required part of how they do business. And I'm going to preface this by saying this isn't just because of environmental interests. This should also be an interest by every taxpayer in this country. We should not be allowing decisions to be made that are not going to be effective for what we want our government to be doing for us because they will be undermined by the effects of climate change. So the need would be for all decisions made, all actions taken by federal agencies to be evaluated for their vulnerability to climate change and designed to maximize the reduction of that risk so that we can deliver on the promises that we're making to the American people, to future generations, and to the environment that we're stewards of.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hansen. And that concludes our hearing on this climate change in public lands. And I want to thank you all again for being here today and for helping us start this important conversation. It is imperative that we hear the best science and that we understand the impact so that we can begin to act on climate change. Unfortunately, our colleagues across the aisle have chosen to focus on outlandish scenarios and outdated rhetoric, but these claims will not slow us down. To our witnesses, your insights and policy recommendations have been helpful and will help us craft bold and impactful legislation around climate change adaptation. Let us not forget how momentous it is that we are once again hosting these important conversations in the halls of Congress. And this is the end of the hearing.
Thank you.
I beg your pardon. I thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony. The members of committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing under Committee Rule 3.0. Members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. There's no further business. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you. Sorry about that. Sorry about that.
Appreciate the
Thank you.